Vadis. Chapter 46. The city burned on. The Circus Maximus had fallen in ruins. Entire streets and alleys in parts which began to burn first were falling in turn. After every fall, pillars of flame rose from a time to the very sky. The wind had changed and blew now with mighty force from the sea, bearing toward the Cilian and the Esquiline and the Viminal rivers of flame, bronze, and cinders. Still the authorities provided for rescue. At command of Tigellinus, who had hastened from Antium the third day before, houses on the Esquiline were turned down so that the fire reaching empty spaces died for itself. That was, however, undertaken solely to save a remnant of the city. To save that which was burning was not to be thought of. There was need also to guard against further result of the ruin. Incalculable, incalcul- incalculable wealth had perished in Rome. All the property of its citizens had vanished. Hundreds of thousands of people were wandering in utter want outside the walls. Hunger had begun to pinch this throng the second day. For the immense stores of provisions in the city had burned with it. In the universe disorder and in the destruction of authority, no one had thought of furnishing new supplies. Only after the arrival of Tigellinus were proper orders sent to Ostia, but meanwhile the people had grown more threatening. The house at Aqua Appia, in which Tigellinus lodged for the moment, was surrounded by crowds of women, who for morning till late at night cried, "Bread and roof!" Vainly did praetorians, brought from the great camp between the Via Salaria and the Nomentana, strive to maintain order of some kind. Here and there they were met by open armed resistance. In places weaponless crowds pointed to the burning city and shouted, "Kill us in view of that fire." They abused Caesar, the Augustins, the Praetorians. Excitement rose every moment, so that Tigellinus, looking at night on the thousands of fires around the city, said to himself that those were fires in hostile camps. Besides flour, as much baked bread as possible was brought at his command, not only from Ostia but from all towns and neighboring villages. When the first installment came at night to the Emporium, the people broke the chief gate toward the Aventine, seized all supplies in the twinkle of an eye, and caused terrible disturbance. In the light of the conflagration they fought for loaves, and trampled many of them into the earth. Flour from torn bags whitened like snow from the whole space from the granary to the arcs of Drusus and Germanicus. The uproar continued till soldiers seized the building and dispersed the crowd with arrows and missiles. Never since the invasion of the Gauls under Brennus had Rome beheld such disaster. People in despair compared the two conflagrations, but in the time of Brennus the capital remained. Now the capital was encircled by a dreadful wreath of flame. The marbles, is true, were not blazing, but at night, when the wind swept the flames aside, for a moment rows of columns in the lofty sanctuary of Jove were visible, red as glowing coals. In the days of Brennus, moreover, Rome had a disciplined, integral people attached to the city and its altars. But now crowds of a many-tongued populace roamed nomad-like around the walls of burning Rome, people composed for the greater part of slaves and freedmen, excited, disorderly, and ready, under the pressure of one to turn against authority and the city. But the very immensity of the fire was terrified every heart, disarmed the crowd in a certain measure. After the fire might come famine and disease, and to complete the misfortune the terrible heat of July had appeared. It was impossible to breathe air inflamed both by fire and the sun. Night brought not relief; on the contrary, it presented a hell. During daylight an awful and ominous spectacle met the eye. In the center of the giant city on heights was turned into a roaring volcano. Round about as far as the Alban hills was one boundless camp, formed of sheds, tents, huts, vehicle bales, packs, stands, fires, all covered with smoke and dust. Lightning by the sun rays reddened by passing through smoke, everything filled with roars, shouts, threats, hatred, and terror. A monstrous swarm of men, women, and children. Mingled with Quirites were Greeks, shaggy men from the north with blue eyes, Africans and Asiatics. Among citizens were slaves, freedmen, gladiators, merchants, mechanics, servants, and soldiers, a real sea of people flowing around the island of fire. Various reports moved the sea as wind does a real one. These reports were favorable and unfavorable. People told of immense supplies of wheat and clothing to be brought to the emporium and distributed gratis. It was said, too, that provinces in Asia and Africa will be stripped of their wealth at Caesar's command, and the treasures thus gained be given to the inhabitants of Rome, so that each man might build his own dwelling. It was noised about also that water in the aqueducts had been poisoned. That Nero intended to annihilate the city, destroy the inhabitants to the last person, then move to Greece or Egypt, and the rule of the world from a new place. Each report ran with lightning speed, and each found belief among the rabble, causing outbursts of hope, anger, terror, or rage. Finally, a kind of fever mastered those nomadic thousands. The beliefs of Christians that the end of the world by fire was at hand spread even among adherents of the gods, and extended daily. People fell into torpor or madness. In clouds lightened by the burning, gods were seen gazing down on the ruin. Hands were stretched toward those gods, then to implore pity or send them curses. Meanwhile, soldiers, aided by a certain number of inhabitants, continued to tear down houses on the Escaline and the Celian. As also in the Trans-Tiber, these divisions were saved therefore in considerable part, but in the city itself were destroyed incalculable treasures accumulated through centuries of conquest, priceless works of art, splendid temples, the most precious monuments of Rome past and Rome's glory. They foresaw that for all Rome there will remain barely a few parts on the edges, and that hundreds of thousands of people will be without a roof. Some spread reports that the soldiers were tearing down houses not to stop the fire, but to prevent any part of the city from being saved. The Hellenists sent courier after courier to Antium, imploring Caesar in each letter to come and calm the despairing people with his presence. But Nero moved only when fire had ceased at Dominus Transitoria, and he hurried so as not to miss the moment in which the conflagration should be at its highest. Meanwhile, fire had reached the Via Nomentana, but turned from it at once with a change of wind toward the Via Latea and the Tiber. It surrounded the Capitol, spread along the Forum Boarium, destroyed everything which it had spared before, and approached the Palatine a second time. The Hellenes, assembling all Praetorian forces, dispatched courier after courier to Caesar with announcement that he will lose nothing to the grandeur of the spectacle, for the fire had increased. But Nero, who was on the road, wished to come at night, so as to state himself all the better with a view of the Persian capital. Therefore he halted in the neighborhood of Aqua Albana, and summoning to his tent the tragedian Aliturus, decided with his aid on posture, look, and expression, learned fitting gestures, disputing with the actor stubbornly whether at the words, O sacred city, which seemed more enduring than Ida, he was to raise both hands, or holding in one the formica, drop it by his side and raise only the other. This question seemed to him then more important than all others. Starting at last about nightfall, he took counsel of Petronius, who also whether to the lines describing The catastrophe he might add a few magnificent blasphemies against the gods, and whether considerable from the standpoint of art, they will not have rushed spontaneously from the mouth of a man in such position, a man who was losing his birthplace. At length he approached the walls without midnight, with his numerous court, composed of whole detachments of noble senators, knights, freedmen, slaves, women, and children. 16,000 Praetorians, arranged in line of battle along the road, guarded the peace and safety of his entrance, and held the excited populace at a proper distance. The people cursed, shouted, and hissed on seeing that retinue, but dared not attack it. In many places, however, applause was given, but the rabble, which owning nothing, had lost nothing in the fire, and which hoped for a more bountiful distribution than usual of wheat, olives, clothing, and money. Finally, shouts, hyacinth, and applause were drawn in the blare of horns and trumpets, which the Hellenes had caused to be sounded. Nero, on arriving at the Ostian gate, halted and said, "Houseless ruler of a houseless people, where shall I lay my unfortunate head for the night?" After he had passed the Clivus Delphini, he ascended the Appian aqueduct on steps prepared purposely. After him followed the Augustinians and a choir of singers bearing cithare, lutes, and other musical instruments. All held the breath in their breasts, waiting to learn if he would say some great words, which for their own safety they ought to remember. But he stood solemn, silent, in a purple mantle on a worth of golden laurels, gazing at the raging might of the flames. When Terpnos gave him a golden lute, he raised his eyes to the sky, filled with the conflagration, as if he were waiting for inspiration. The people pointed at him from as far as he stood in the bloody gleam. In the distance fiery serpents were hissing. The ancient and most sacred edifices were in flames. The temple of Hercules, reared by Evander, was burning. The temple of Jupiter Stator was burning. The temple of Luna, built by Sevius Tullius, the house of Numa Pompilius, the sanctuary of Vesta, with the penates of the Roman people. Through waving flames the Capitol appeared at intervals. The past in the spirit of Rome was burning, but he, Caesar, was there with a lute in his hand and a theatrical expression on his face, not thinking of his perishing country, but of his posture and prophetic words with which he might describe best the greatness of the catastrophe, rose most admiration and received the warmest plaudits. He detested that city. He detested its inhabitants, beloved only his own songs and verses. Hence he rejoiced in heart that at last he saw a tragedy like that which he was writing. The verse maker was happy. The declaimer felt inspired. The seeker for emotions was delighted at the awful sight, and thought with rapture that even the destruction of Troy was nothing if compared with the destruction of that giant city. What more could he desire? There was war ruling Rome in flames, and he standing on the arcs of the aqueduct with a golden lute, conspicuous, purple, admired, magnificent, poetic. Down below, somewhere in the darkness, the people are muttering and storming, but let them mutter. Ages will pass, thousands of years will go by, but mankind will remember and glorify the poet who in that night sang the fall and burning of Troy. What was Homer compared with him? What Apollo himself with his hollow out lute? He raised his hands and striking the strings pronounced the words of Priam. O nest of my fathers, O dear cradle, his voice in open air, with the roar of the conflagration and the distant murmur of crowding thousands, seemed marvelous, weak, uncertain, and low, and the sound of the accompaniment like the buzzing of insects. But senators, dignitaries, and Augustinians assembled on the aqueduct bowed their heads and listened in silent rapture. He sang long, and his motive was ever sadder. At moments when he stopped to catch breath, the chorus of singers repeated the last verse. Then Nero cast the tragic sirma, a robe of train worn specially by tragic actors, from his shoulder with a gesture learned from Aliturus, struck the lute and sang on. When at last he had finished the lines composed, he improvised, seeking grandiose comparisons in the spectacle unfolded before him. His face began to change. He was not moved, it is true, by the destruction of his country capital, but he was delighted and moved with the pathos of his own words to such degree that his eyes filled with tears on the sudden. At last he dropped the lute to his feet with a clatter, and wrapping himself in the sirma, stood as petrified like one of those statues of Niobe which ornamented the courtyard of the Palatine. Soon a storm of applause broke the silence, but in the distance this was answered by the howling of multitudes. No one doubted then that Caesar had given command to burn the city, so as to afford himself a spectacle and sing a song to it. Nero, when he heard the cry from hundreds of thousands, turned to the Augustans with the side, resigned smiles of a man who is suffering from injustice. See, said he, how the quiri- quirites value poetry and me. Quirites. Scoundrels, answered Vatinus, command the Petronians, Lord, to fall on them. Nero turned to the Hellenos. Can I count on the loyalty of the soldiers? Yes, divinity, answered the prefect. But Petronius shrugged his shoulder and said, on their loyalty, yes, but not on their numbers. Remain meanwhile where thou art, for there is safest, but there is need to pacify the people. Seneca was of this opinion also, as was Lucinus the consul. Meanwhile the excitement below was increasing. The people were arming with stones, then poles, sticks from the wagons, planks, and various pieces of iron. After a while, some of the Praetorian leaders came declaring that the cohorts, pressed by the multitude, kept the line of battle with extreme difficulty, and being without orders to attack. They knew not what to do. "Oh God," said Nero, "what a night! On one side a fire, on the other a raging sea of people," and he fell to seeking expressions the most splendid to describe the danger of the moment. But seeing around him alarmed looks and pale faces, he frightened with the others. "Give me dark mantle with a hood," cried he. "Must it come really to battle?" "Lord," said the Hellenos in an uncertain voice, "I have done what I could, but danger is threatening. Speak, O Lord, to the people. Make them promises." "Shall Caesar speak to the rabble? Let another do that in my name. Who will undertake it?" "I," answered Petronius calmly. "Go, my friend, thou art most faithful to me in every necessity. Go and spare no promises." Petronius turned to the retinue with careless, sarcastic expression. "Senators here present, also Piso, Nerva, and Senecio, follow me." Then he descended the aqueduct slowly. Those whom he had summoned followed, not without hesitation, but with a certain confidence which his calmness had given them. Petronius, halting at the foot of the arcs, gave command to bring him a white horse, and mounted, rode on at the head of the cavalcade. Between the deep ranks of the Praetorians to the black, howling multitude, he was unarmed, having only a slender ivory cane which he carried habitually. When he had ridden up, he pushed his horse into the throng. All round, visible in the light of the burning, were upright hands armed with every manner of weapon, inflamed eyes, sweating faces, billowing and foaming lips. A mad sea of people surrounded him and his attendants. Round about was a sea of heads, moving, roaring, dreadful. These outbursts increased and became an unearthly roar. Poles, forks, and even swords were brandishing above Petronius. Grasping hands were stretching towards his horse reins and towards him, but he rode farther, cold, indifferent, contemptuous. At moments he struck the most insolent heads with his cane. as if clearing a road for himself in an ordinary crowd, and that confidence of his, that calmness, amazed the raging rabble. They recognized him at length, and numerous voices began to shout, Petronius, arbiter elegantiarium, Petronius, Petronius, was heard on all sides, and as the name was repeated, the faces about came less terrible, that uproar less savage, for that exquisite patrician, though he had never striven for the favor of the populace, was still their favorite. He passed for a humane and magnanimous man, and his popularity had increased especially since the affair of Pedanius Secundus, when he spoke in favor of mitigating the cruel sentence condemning all slaves that the prefect to death. When he spoke in favor of mitigating the cruel sentence condemning all the slaves of that prefect to death, the slaves more especially loved him thenceforward with that unbounded love which the oppressed and the unfortunate are accustomed to give those who show them even small sympathy. Besides, in that moment was added curiosity as to what Caesar's envoy will say, for no one doubted that Caesar had sent them. He removed, he, he removed his white toga, bordered with scarlet, raised it in the air, and waved it above his head in sign that he wished to speak. Silence, silence, cried the people in all sides. After a while there was silence. Then he straightened himself on the horse and said in a clear, firm voice, Citizens, let those who hear me repeat my words to those who are more distant, and bear yourself, all of you, like men, not like beasts in the arena. We will, we will. Then listen, the city will be rebuilt. The gardens of Lucullus, Maecenas, Caesar, and Agrippa will be open to you. Tomorrow will begin the distribution of wheat, wine, and olives, so that every man might be full to their throat. Then Caesar will have games for you, such as the world has not seen yet. During these games, banquets and gifts will be given you. Ye will be richer after the fire than before it. A murmur answered him which spreads to the center in every direction, as wave rises on water in which a stone has been cast. Those nearer repeated his words to those more distant. Afterward were heard here and there shouts of anger or applause, which turned at length into one universal call of panem ad circenses. Petronius wrapped himself in his toga and listened for a time without moving, resembling in his white garment a marble statue. The uproar increased, drowned the roar of the fire, was answered from every side and from every increasing distances. But evidently the envoy had something to add, for he waited. Finally, commanding silence anew, he cried, I promise you panem et circenses. I now give a shout in honor of Caesar, who feeds and clothes you. Then go to sleep, dear populace, for the dawn will begin before long. He turned his horse, and tapping lightly with his cane the heads and faces of those who stood his way, he rode slowly to the praetorian ranks. Soon he was under the aqueduct. He found almost a panic above, where they had not understood the shout panem ad circenses, and supposed it to be a new outburst of rage. They had not even expected that Petronius would save himself. So Nero, when he saw him, ran to the steps with a face pale for emotion and inquired, Well, what are they doing? Is there a battle? Petronius drew air from his lungs, breathed deeply, and answered, By Pollux, they are sweating, and such a stench. Will someone give me an epilema? For I am faint. Then he turned to Caesar. I promised them, said he, wheat, olives, and the opening of the gardens and games. They worship thee and you, and are howling in thy honor. Gods, what a foul odor those plebeians have. I had Petronians ready, cried the Hellenos, and hadst thou not quieted them, the shouters would have been silenced forever. It is a pity, Caesar, that thou didst not let me use force. Petronius looked at him, shrugged his shoulders, and added, "The chance is not lost. Thou must have to use it tomorrow." "No, no," cried Caesar. "I will give command to open gardens to them and distribute wheat. Thanks to thee, Petronius, I will have games, and that song which I sang to them will sing publicly." Then he placed his hands on the arbiter's shoulder, was silent for a moment. Then he placed his hands on the arbiter's shoulder, was silent a moment, and starting up at last inquired, "Tell me sincerely, how did I seem to thee while I was singing?" Oh my God! "Thou wert worthy of a spectacle, and the spectacle was worthy of thee," said Petronius. But let us look at it. But let us look at it again, said he, turning to the fire, and bid farewell to ancient Rome.